September of 1886 brought dry, biting winds tearing across the Nebraska sandhills. But the real spectacle in Ash Hollow had absolutely nothing to do with the weather. Kalen Voss, a former kiln and lime furnace repairman, spent the morning digging a long trench through the center of a new cabin floor. At first, most folks assumed he was laying a foundation. That is, until they realized where the chimney was supposed to go. Instead of reaching upward toward the roof, the flue dropped into the ground. The idle chatter of the street suddenly died. Wagon wheels whined to a halt. Silas Boone, the settlement's most experienced chimney mason, pulled his team to a halt and squinted down into the bizarre trench as if looking at the work of a madman. After a long, heavy silence, Silas just shook his head. "That isn't a chimney," his voice rang out, laced with mockery. "That's a smoke trap." Laughter erupted from the gathering crowd. Surrounded by the jeers, Kalen didn't argue. He didn't even flinch. He simply tightened his grip, raised his pickaxe, and brought it down into the dirt again. To the crowd, the upside-down chimney was nothing more than a foolish spectacle. But to Kalen's wife Miriam, watching quietly from a distance, it was a desperate matter of survival. While outsiders joked about the upside-down chimney, her eyes grew heavy as her thoughts drifted back to the harrowing winter before. She remembered those endless hours long after midnight, when the ragged coughing of their young daughter Nora would tear through the silence and echo off the wooden walls. The relentless cold had forced their older son, Elias, to sleep curled up as close to the stove as possible. There were times when the toes of his boots grew hot from resting too close to the fire, yet his back and the rest of the cabin remained freezing cold. Even though Miriam had carefully hung old quilts across the doorway, the prairie wind still found a way to slip its invisible claws inside. By March, the woodpile had nearly disappeared. Kalen remembered the exhausting weight of every single armload. The fire had burned for months on end. Yet the cold stubbornly remained. Somewhere during that desperate winter, a haunting question took root in his mind. Maybe the problem was never a lack of heat. Maybe the heat simply wasn't staying where it belonged. Driven by that thought, Kalen spent many evenings standing quietly outside the cabin, staring up at the chimney. He watched bright sparks drift into the darkness, carrying waves of invaluable warmth straight up into the night sky. Then he would glance back inside, where Miriam sat beside the bed, wrapping a thin blanket around herself and Nora's frail body to keep them warm. That cruel contrast ate at him. Years of making a living repairing brick kilns and lime furnaces had taught Kalen a core principle. Hot gases carried enormous value. In those systems, builders worked tirelessly, engineering ways to keep the heat moving through the brick for as long as possible before allowing it to escape. Cabins, however, worked entirely differently. Most of their warmth rushed straight up the chimney and vanished. The more Kalen thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. Heat leaving too soon belonged to the sky, not to the family who had broken a sweat chopping the firewood. He decided it was time to change that. One evening, Kalen spread a rough pine board across two sawhorses and began sketching with a piece of charcoal. The drawing looked strange, even before it was finished. Instead of sending smoke directly upward, the flue dropped below floor level, traveled nearly 19 feet through a stone mass, and only then turned toward the roof. Word traveled quickly. By the following afternoon, Silas Boone was standing over the board with his arms crossed. His finger traced the black line running beneath the floor. "Hot gases don't want to go down," he said. "You're trying to force nature to do the opposite of what it does." Several men nearby nodded. The design looked wrong. Not complicated. Wrong. Before long, Orrin Pike, the town's hardware and supply merchant, was repeating the story to customers. Each time he told it, the chimney became a little more ridiculous. Within a week, almost everyone in Ash Hollow knew about Kalen's plan. Most no longer called it a heating system. They called it the upside-down chimney. A few days later, Reverend Abel Hart stopped by the cabin site. Unlike the others, he never laughed. He studied the trench, listened to Kalen's explanation, then turned toward Miriam. Nora sat nearby, playing with a handful of dried grass, while Elias sorted small stones into a bucket. Abel's expression remained calm. "What happens if smoke comes back through that system in the middle of the night?" he asked. "What happens when the children are asleep?" The question hung in the air. This was not mockery. It was concern. Kalen heard every word. He offered no argument and no defense. Later that evening, he returned to the charcoal drawing and made several changes. 3 clean outdoors appeared along the flue path. Small inspection points were marked beside key turns. If the system was going to work, it needed a way to be checked, cleaned, and controlled. The danger Abel described was real. Ignoring it would have been easier than solving it. With the blueprints finally settled, over the next 3 weeks, the project settled into a rhythm that touched every member of the family. Before sunrise, Kalen and Elias hitched a small handcart and headed toward a dry creek bed nearly half a mile away. Limestone lay scattered along the banks where spring floods had once cut through the soil. The larger pieces took both of them to move. Some weighed more than Elias could lift, so he learned to roll them onto wooden skids and drag them behind the cart instead. Each trip added only a little to the growing pile beside the cabin. Then they went back for more. While father and son gathered stone, Miriam worked beside a long wooden trough. Clay from a nearby stream bank was mixed with wood ash saved from the previous winter. The mixture was heavy and stubborn. By afternoon, dried clay coated her sleeves and hands. Nearby, Nora contributed in the only way she could. She searched the grasslands for short dry stems and carried them back in small bundles. Those fibers would strengthen the mortar and help prevent cracking as it dried. The work continued day after day. By the end of the 3rd week, nearly 2.7 tons of limestone stood stacked beside the cabin. Almost 1,900 fire-damaged red bricks had been collected from an abandoned kiln site. 6 barrels of wood ash waited under canvas covers, and several wagon loads of blue-green clay sat ready for use. People passing by often slowed to stare. The growing mound looked less like the materials for a heater and more like the beginning of a stone fortress. For the first time, even some of the skeptics stopped laughing quite as loudly. Whatever Kalen was building, it was no longer just an idea drawn in charcoal. It now occupied a very real space in the center of the family's life. The first part of the system to take shape surprised nearly everyone who saw it. Most frontier stoves were built around large fireboxes. Bigger fires meant more heat. At least that was the common belief. Kalen went in the opposite direction. Using the best of the salvaged brick, he laid out a firebox barely 18 inches wide and 24 inches long. Its top sat only a little above knee height. The dimensions looked absurd beside the growing stone bench that would eventually surround it. Silas Boone arrived midway through construction and stared at the opening. "That thing's too small," he said. "A cabin this size will eat more heat than that can make." Kalen continued setting brick. The criticism was reasonable. Most people would have agreed with it, yet the firebox was small by design. Years spent around kilns had taught him that a hot, clean fire often accomplished more than a large, lazy one. He wasn't trying to keep flames burning all day. He wanted intense combustion that extracted as much energy as possible from every piece of fuel. Miriam knelt beside the wall, checking the brick courses with a straight board before the mortar hardened. Whenever a row drifted out of line, she pressed it back into place. Elias worked a few feet away, carrying solid bricks one at a time from the supply stack. By evening, his arms ached, but the firebox had gained another course. Near the bottom of the structure, Kalen left a carefully measured air inlet. The opening sat low enough to encourage a strong draft from the moment the fire caught. Fresh air would feed the flames directly, instead of drifting through the cabin first. The arrangement looked simple. In reality, every dimension served a purpose. Silas saw a firebox that seemed too small to survive a Nebraska winter. Kalen saw the beginning of a system designed to burn hotter, cleaner, and faster than anything most of Ash Hollow had ever used. With the firebox finished, attention shifted to the part of the design that caused the most confusion. The trench running beneath the cabin floor was not a straight tunnel. Kalen shaped it into a long heat path. The channel measured 16 inches deep, 9 inches wide, and roughly 11 inches tall. Starting at the firebox, it traveled beneath the center of the cabin for 18 feet and 8 inches before finally turning toward the chimney stack. Along the way, the route bent 4 times. Each turn had a purpose. Every extra foot forced hot gases to surrender more heat before they could escape outside. That was exactly what Kalen wanted. The challenge was maintenance. Ash and soot would eventually settle in the slower sections of the flue. To solve that problem, he salvaged old cast-iron access doors from a collapsed homestead several miles away. One clean-out door was installed at each major dead corner where debris was most likely to collect. Silas had warned that hidden flues became useless when owners could not reach them. Kalen listened. Then, he built a way to reach them. Above the channel, limestone and broken kiln brick began forming a massive bench through the center of the cabin. Stone after stone disappeared into the structure. The pile that had once sat outside slowly transformed into a solid thermal mass weighing several tons. Miriam spent hours sealing every joint with clay mortar, reinforced by ash and dried grass fibers. Any crack large enough to leak smoke was repaired immediately. Nothing was left to chance. Elias followed behind with a narrow wooden gauge cut from scrap lumber. Whenever a section of flue narrowed too much, he marked it for correction. If a passage became uneven, Kalen reset the bricks before moving forward. Nearby, Nora dropped handfuls of dry grass into the mixing trough one bundle at a time. The task was small. Her contribution was not. By late afternoon, the strange collection of trenches, brickwork, and stone finally began to resemble a complete system. For the first time, even people who doubted the idea could see that it was more than an experiment. It was engineered, and every piece appeared to belong exactly where it was. As autumn shortened the days, another problem began to take shape. It wasn't hidden inside the flue. It wasn't buried beneath the stone bench. It sat quietly in Orrin Pike's ledger. One afternoon, Orrin arrived with the last pieces of salvaged cast iron Kalen had ordered. He unloaded the metal beside the cabin and watched Miriam work mortar into the joints between the limestone blocks. For a while, he said nothing. Then he glanced toward the growing heater. That's a lot of material tied up in one idea. Miriam kept smoothing the clay with the edge of a wooden trowel. Orrin shifted his weight. The account's getting larger than most folks realize. His voice carried no anger, only concern. If this thing works, none of it matters. But if it doesn't, he paused before finishing the thought. There won't be enough money left for another stove before winter. The statement lingered in the cool afternoon air. This time there was no laughter, no crowd, no jokes about upside-down chimneys. The risk had become something far more serious. Miriam understood that better than anyone. She pressed another handful of clay into a narrow seam and moved to the next stone. Across the cabin, Kalen was fitting brick around a clean-out opening. He had heard every word. The sound of Orrin's wagon could not have carried farther than the warning itself, yet he never turned around. The work continued. A few feet away, Elias watched the exchange in silence. Until then, the criticism had seemed almost harmless. Men laughed. Men argued. Then everyone went home. Now, the stakes looked different. For the first time, he realized his father wasn't simply defending an unusual idea. The coming winter itself had been placed on the table, and the entire family was betting on the outcome. The first firing drew more attention than any stage of construction. By mid-morning, several townspeople had gathered outside the cabin. Some were curious. Others expected to witness a failure. Kalen knelt beside the firebox and arranged the fuel carefully. Dry cottonwood kindling went in first. Corncobs followed. Twisted bundles of buffalo grass filled the remaining space. A single match touched the tinder. The fire caught immediately. Within minutes, flames rolled through the small chamber exactly as intended. Heat built quickly. The draft began pulling air through the lower inlet. For a brief moment, Everything looked promising. Then, Elias wrinkled his nose. Something smelled wrong. A thin ribbon of smoke drifted from a joint near the firebox before curling into the cabin air. The room fell silent. Another wisp appeared, then another. Miriam reacted instantly. She crossed the room, took Nora by the hand, and guided her toward the open doorway. Outside, several onlookers exchanged glances. Silas Boone didn't look surprised. His eyes followed the smoke for several seconds before he finally spoke. "It's starting," he said. "The problem I warned about is starting." The words landed hard because they matched what everyone could see. This wasn't rumor. Smoke had entered the cabin. A few moments later, Reverend Abel Hart stepped forward. His attention never settled on the flue or the firebox. Instead, he looked toward the doorway, where Miriam stood with the children. "I don't much care who's right," he said quietly. "I care whether those two stay safe." For the first time since the project began, the danger felt real. And for the first time, Kalen had no immediate answer. Kalen never considered tearing the system apart. The smoke had revealed a problem. That was all. For the next 3 nights, the cabin remained lit long after sunset by a single oil lamp. While most of Ash Hollow slept, Kalen studied the heater one section at a time. Elias stayed beside him, holding the lamp whenever another part of the flue needed inspection. The work moved slowly. Shadows stretched across the stone bench, while warm air and smoke followed paths that could not always be seen. Near the doorway, Miriam sat wrapped in a blanket, with Nora resting against her shoulder. Neither complained. Both understood what was at stake. The answer finally appeared during the 3rd night. One of the turns beneath the bench was too sharp. As the hot gases reached that corner, their movement slowed more than expected. During the first minutes of a burn, before the entire system had fully heated, the draft weakened just enough to allow smoke to drift backward. The flaw was small. Its consequences were not. The following morning, several bricks were removed and reset. The troublesome turn was widened. At the far end of the system, Kalen extended the chimney stack another 18 inches above the roofline. Before lighting the fire again, he also fed a small bundle of dry buffalo grass into the flue outlet, warming the chimney and encouraging the draft before the main burn began. Silas noticed the repairs from across the road. He watched without offering advice. Later that afternoon, Kalen lit the heater for a second test. The flames caught. Heat moved into the system. Everyone waited. Minutes passed. The air remained clear. No gray ribbon appeared along the joints. No smoke curled into the room. For the first time since construction began, the upside-down chimney behaved exactly as Kalen had intended. It wasn't proof that the coming winter had been defeated, but it was proof that the system deserved another chance. By November, people began noticing something unusual about the Voss cabin. The heater was not being used the way most frontier stoves were. Instead of feeding wood into the fire throughout the day, Kalen built one intense burn each morning. Dry cottonwood, corn cobs, and buffalo grass produced a hot, fast fire that charged the stone bench with heat. Once the fuel was consumed, the draft was closed, and the flames disappeared. The routine looked wrong to anyone passing by. A cold morning should have meant smoke rising from a chimney all day long. Yet the Voss cabin often sat quiet. Inside, small signs of change continued to appear. Miriam noticed that frost no longer coated the inside edges of the windows as heavily as it had the previous year. Some mornings, only a thin white line remained in the corners. Elias paid attention to something else: the woodpile. By that point in the season, it should have been noticeably smaller. Instead, much of it still stood untouched. Kalen rarely commented on the results. One evening, he checked a thermometer, scratched a single number onto the edge of a pine board, and returned to his work. The mark remained there. Nothing more was written beside it. The real evidence could already be seen in the cabin itself. January arrived under a sky that seemed unwilling to brighten. The jokes about the upside-down chimney had largely faded by then. Most people were busy preparing for the heart of winter. One afternoon, Silas Boone rode out to the Voss cabin again. This time, there was no trace of amusement in his face. He climbed down from the wagon and stood beside the woodpile for a moment before speaking. The geese left early. Kalen looked up from a bundle of split cottonwood but said nothing. Silas continued. The horses at Miller's place have been standing with their backs to the north wind all week, and the barometer's been falling faster than I've seen in years. The words carried more weight than any argument he had made before. Men who spent their lives outdoors paid attention to signs like those. According to several trappers returning from the western grasslands, the weather felt disturbingly similar to an older winter that people still talked about in lowered voices. Livestock had frozen in open pastures during that cold spell. Entire hay reserves disappeared before spring arrived. A long silence settled between the two men. Silas still wasn't convinced that a horizontal flue was the answer. That hadn't changed. What had changed was his confidence in the season ahead. Winter no longer felt like a debate. It felt like a judge approaching the bench. "The weather's coming," he finally said. Then he turned toward his wagon. Kalen watched him leave before carrying another armload of dry cottonwood into the cabin. One bundle joined several others, stacked beside the firebox. No further preparation was possible. The design had been built. The waiting was almost over. The cold arrived faster than anyone expected. One morning, the prairie woke beneath a hard gray sky. By evening, the temperature had plunged. Wind swept across the sandhills without slowing, striking cabins, barns, and fences with the same relentless force. Inside Silas Boone's house, the stove worked exactly as it always had. The fire burned hot. Wood crackled. Heat poured from the cast-iron body. Yet, comfort never seemed to last. About every 40 minutes, another log disappeared into the firebox. Silas barely finished one task before returning to feed the stove again. The routine repeated through the day and well into the night. A strange imbalance settled over the room. Anyone standing near the stove felt excessive heat against their face. A few steps farther away, the air changed completely. Cold lingered along the walls and gathered in the corners. Each time the stove pulled fresh air through the chimney, replacement air found its way into the cabin through tiny gaps between the boards. Invisible drafts slid across the floor. They brushed against boots and crept beneath blankets. Near midnight, Silas noticed his son sleeping in a coat. The sight bothered him more than the weather. The stove was consuming wood exactly as designed. Flames remained strong. The chimney drew well. Nothing appeared broken. Still, the house demanded more fuel with every passing hour. Silas sat beside the fire and watched another log collapse into glowing coals. For years, he had judged a heating system by the size of its fire. Now a different question began to form. If the flames were doing their job, where was all the warmth going? That same night, the Voss cabin followed a very different rhythm. Hours had passed since the morning burn. The firebox contained nothing but a bed of gray ash. No flames danced behind the iron door. No fresh wood waited beside the opening. Yet warmth still lingered inside the room. The stone bench, running through the center of the cabin, held the day's heat, the way a sunlit boulder holds warmth after sunset. Anyone sitting against it could feel the difference immediately. Miriam took advantage of it. A batch of bread rested near the warm stone while she prepared dough for the next morning. The process required no rush. The cabin remained comfortable without constant attention to a fire. Across the room, Elias sat on a stool repairing a worn bridle strap. The leather had stiffened during the cold spell, but his fingers worked steadily. Nearby, Nora slept on a folded blanket laid across the stone bench. The sound that had haunted the previous winter was absent. No coughing interrupted the quiet. No blanket needed to be adjusted every hour. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls with growing force. Loose snow hissed across the prairie. The weather was becoming exactly what Silas had feared. Inside, nobody celebrated. Kalen certainly didn't. He sat near the far end of the bench, listening to the gusts strike the cabin and waiting for the real test. The system had survived a few cold nights already. That meant very little compared to what might still be coming. His eyes occasionally drifted toward the stone mass, not with pride, with curiosity. The heater had stored enough warmth to carry the family this far. The question now was whether it could still be holding heat when dawn arrived. Winter would decide that soon enough. By the fourth day, Winter was asking a different question. Temperature still mattered. Fuel mattered more. The cold had settled over Ash Hollow, long enough to expose weaknesses that could not be measured by a thermometer. Wood piles that had looked generous in December suddenly seemed much smaller. Every trip to the woods required effort. Every missing log now carried weight. One well on the eastern side of the settlement froze solid. A farmer near the creek pulled boards from an old fence and fed them into his stove. Before long, others were doing the same. Sections of rail fence disappeared across the prairie as families searched for anything that would burn. At Orrin Pike's store, concern replaced conversation. The merchant unlocked a reserve shed he rarely touched and began selling wood he had intended to hold until late winter. Even then, nobody knew how long the supply would last. People stopped talking about temperatures. Instead, they counted what remained. Half a cord, a quarter cord, 3 days, maybe 4. That became the new language of survival. Meanwhile, the Voss woodpile stood largely unchanged. Bundles of cottonwood remained securely under their canvas cover. Late that evening, Miriam stepped outside to gather fuel. The wind bit through her coat instantly. She reached down and gathered a few small pieces of wood, all the system would need for its single morning burn, and paused. In the dim light, she stared at the sheer size of the stack that still remained. She didn't need any more proof. Kalen's heater was proving something far more valuable than mere comfort. It was stretching every piece of firewood further than anyone had thought possible, standing as a quiet fortress against the winter's depletion. On the 6th day, the wind finally began to weaken. Not all at once. The change arrived in small signs. Snow no longer raced across the open ground. Chimney smoke rose straighter. Doors could be opened without being torn from a person's grip. Ash Hollow emerged from the cold looking as though it had survived a siege. Fence lines that once stretched across the prairie now ended abruptly in empty gaps. Wood piles stood reduced to scattered stacks and loose scraps. More than one family had burned fuel they never intended to touch before spring. The storm had taken its payment. Silas Boone stepped onto his porch shortly after sunrise. Ice clung to his beard. The skin around his eyes looked older than it had a week earlier. Several nights of broken sleep had left their mark. The stove behind him was still burning, and another armload of wood would soon disappear into it. For a moment, he studied what remained of his own pile. Then he looked toward the western edge of town. Months earlier, curiosity had drawn him to Kalen's cabin. After that came skepticism, then criticism. What remained now was something entirely different. A question. Silas pulled on his coat and started walking. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he crossed the settlement. Along the way, evidence of the storm surrounded him. Broken fence rails protruded from drifts. Empty wood racks stood beside cabins. The cold had examined every heating system in Ash Hollow and left its verdict behind. By the time Kalen's cabin came into view, Silas had stopped thinking about arguments. He wasn't heading there to defend his position. He wasn't going there to laugh. The winter had already settled that part of the matter. What Silas wanted now was the truth. By the time Silas reached the cabin, the sky had begun to clear. Thin sunlight reflected from the snow and painted the prairie in pale silver. For a moment, he stood outside the door, gathering his thoughts. Then he knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Warm air rolled past him. Not the sharp blast that comes from standing beside a roaring stove. This warmth felt different, dry, steady, the kind that settles into a room and stays there. Silas stepped inside. His eyes went straight to the firebox. The iron door stood closed. No orange glow escaped through the seams. No crackling logs could be heard. The fire had been out for hours. That much was obvious. Slowly, he looked around the cabin. Miriam sat near the center of the room, mending a torn sleeve. Beside her, Nora rested on the stone bench with a book open across her lap. The child looked comfortable enough to forget there was a blizzard outside. A few feet away, Elias was quietly whittling a piece of pine with a pocket knife. Nobody appeared to be fighting the cold. Nobody was feeding a fire. The scene felt strangely ordinary, and that was exactly what made it remarkable. Silas took another step forward. The stone bench stretched through the center of the cabin like a low wall. Its surface looked no different from any other collection of limestone and brick. Yet the room remained warm. Silas knew enough about heating systems to understand what that should have meant. It should not have been possible without an active fire. Kalen watched him in silence. There was no speech waiting, no explanation prepared in advance. The heater had already done the talking. After several long seconds, Kalen nodded toward the stone bench. "Go ahead," he said. Silas placed a gloved hand on the stone. Then he slowly pulled the glove off and touched it again with bare skin. The stone was still warm, not slightly warm, not holding the last traces of heat from a dying fire. Warm enough that Silas kept his hand there longer than expected. Even so, years of experience prevented him from drawing conclusions too quickly. A warm surface proved very little by itself. He began inspecting the system the same way he would evaluate any chimney or stove in Ash Hollow. The nearest clean-out door came first. Silas opened it and crouched beside the opening. Only a thin layer of ash rested at the bottom of the channel. The passage remained surprisingly clear. He moved to the next access point, then the next. The result was the same. No heavy buildup. No evidence of smoke backing up through the system. His attention shifted to the bends beneath the stone bench. The turns were broad enough to maintain flow, while still forcing the hot gases to travel through the entire length of the heater. A few minutes later, he examined the chimney itself. The draft marks told their own story. The fire had burned hot enough to leave very little unburned residue behind. While Silas worked, the cabin door opened again. Orrin Pike stepped inside and immediately noticed the woodpile stacked along the wall. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. The merchant said nothing. His ledger suddenly seemed less important than the evidence sitting in front of him. Reverend Abel Hart arrived shortly afterward. Unlike Silas, he paid almost no attention to the heater. His eyes settled on Nora. The child sat comfortably on the stone bench, reading while the winter that had terrorized the settlement faded outside. Abel's shoulders relaxed. That alone answered the question he had asked months earlier. By then, Silas had seen enough. The truth was far simpler than the rumors that had spread through town. Kalen had never forced smoke to defy nature. He had built a hotter fire, maintained a stronger draft, and directed that heat through several tons of stone before allowing it to leave. The system wasn't fighting physics. It was using physics more completely than anyone else had thought to do. The conversation that followed was brief. Silas stood beside the stone bench for a long moment before speaking. "I spent most of my life trying to build bigger fires," he said. His eyes drifted toward the heater running beneath the floor. "You spent yours figuring out how to keep the heat from leaving." Nobody rushed to answer. The statement carried enough weight on its own. Kalen certainly didn't treat it like a victory. There was no grin, no reminder of old arguments, no interest in collecting apologies that winter had already delivered. A few neighbors eventually offered money for plans. Others suggested building similar systems for nearby settlements. Kalen declined both. He didn't open a workshop, nor did he turn the design into a business. When someone asked how the heater worked, he pulled out a board and sketched the same charcoal drawing that had once made people laugh. Then he handed it over and returned to whatever task needed doing. Life moved forward. By the fall of 1887, horizontal flues could be found in cabins across Ash Hollow. Some copied Kalen's layout almost exactly. Others borrowed only part of the idea and adapted it to different floor plans. Even Orrin Pike changed. Instead of throwing damaged kiln bricks into a discard pile, he began saving them for future heater projects. Reverend Abel Hart occasionally reminded people that useful knowledge rarely arrived wearing a sign that announced itself as wisdom. Perhaps the most surprising change belonged to Silas Boone. The first cabin he rebuilt was his own. Through it all, Calen's routine stayed remarkably similar. Each morning began with a short, hot fire. The stone absorbed the energy. The rest of the day belonged to the bench. Years later, people still remembered the winter of 1887. Not because of the arguments, not because of the chimney. They remembered it because the weather had settled a question that opinions never could. The people who laughed at Calen were not foolish. They simply trusted what was familiar. Nature cared very little about familiarity. Experience carried no special privilege. Reputation offered no protection. When the temperature falls far enough, winter asks the same question of every idea, every tool, and every tradition. What actually works? And in Ash Hollow, the answer remained warm long after the fire was gone.